Panda, President now, Director NMRC, JNU, Professor Dr. Cynthia Groff, Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, Professor Ajit Mohanty, Chief Advisor, NMRC, JNU, and Dr. Dheer Jigran, Director, Language and Learning Foundation. So I welcome you all, and now I would request Professor Miniti Panda to kindly begin the session.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning. Good afternoon, even for Cynthia, yes. It's a pleasure to have you all on a day like this. The question is not new to us, and we have been struggling with the question of language since long. But of course, today gives a particular context to particular occasion to discuss the old issues once again. And national education policy, of course, gave us a renewed our interest in the area, and is probably creating some more possibilities to intervene in school education and higher education, and do something that we couldn't do earlier. So it is to now see how we understand the question of language of children and students, how we understand the linguistic needs of students in the classroom, and how classroom accommodates those both in the domain of pedagogy and teaching learning materials. NMRC, therefore from NMRC, we thought, why not we have a webinar today? And we normally do it every year, of course, but we decided to work with some of our old friends, and so I invited Professor Ajit Mohanty, Dr. Cynthia Groff, Dr. Dheer Jigran to come on board and share the experiences. And there is, why all these three are on board. Partly because Professor Mohanty has worked extensively on the question of language from a linguistic right perspective, and is a votary of mother tongue-based multilingual education. Dr. Dheer Jigran has been, ever since I know him, he has been addressing the question of language. He has looked into in his books the linguistic profiles of children. He had almost profiled classrooms using language as one of the major parameter in his 2006 book, and then was involved, of course, with educational projects from ministry where he was working earlier, and then subsequently in his own organization, Language and Learning Foundation. Cynthia has done wonderful grassroots level works in Himalayan foothills, especially in Komani region, where she has looked into the language practices in the villages in that region. So I thought, it'll be a nice, group discussing both the language practices in the country as well as the classroom pedagogy in schools, which is invariably informed by, or at least should be informed by, language practices. So, and Dheer particularly works on the question of learning in the classroom, and I think his organization is, initiating a lot of intervention-based programs, including teacher training in the area of multilingual education. And he has actually worked quite a lot in the domain of early literacy, and that's where I find his views very, very insightful. So I thought Dheer is uniquely placed because of his experience in administration and also in academics to reflect on classroom practices, and especially when we talk about institution-based practices and scaling of those practices. So here's the group that's going to talk to you, and it'll be more in a dialogical mode. We will place our views as briefly as possible, and then we'll enter into dialogue. The questions will be obviously asked by the participants and as well as the speakers to each other. and we will maintain the spirit of dialogue in our discussion today. What I will do today, Nikita, you can share the PowerPoint. Maybe for 3-4 minutes, I'll show 2-3 PowerPoints, and then we can stop that, and I'll be extempo. Nikita, can you hear me?
Yeah. I'm just sharing the PowerPoint. Yeah.
I'm simultaneously speaking. Okay.
Which slide do you want me to share?
First slide.
Okay.
The National Multilingual Resource Consortium started more than a decade before with support from UNICEF, and received additional fundings from NCERT, Van Leer Foundation, and MHRD. And its mandate was to work on multilingual education. And so we did several studies, several work from this organization, from this consortium. The recent one I will just mention, because I'll be building what I'll discuss now from these texts. We carried out 3 sociolinguistic surveys. One in 2016 in the district of Siroy, Rajasthan. The second was in Barwani district of Madhya Pradesh in 2018. And the third one, we again went back to Siroy district, Rajasthan, but we, in 2016, we extensively studied Garasia community, and of course, other communities, Marwadi and other communities living in the same region, and their linguistic needs. In 2018, we studied the sociolinguistic profile of Bhili and other communities in remote tribal areas of another district, Abu Road, in Rajasthan. Of course, we had done earlier sociolinguistic surveys in Odisha, but I'll be building more on my recent work for this brief presentation. And also 2 small, papers, one a very major one on the state market and multilingualism, published in 2021. And the third one is the recent most, which is titled as Translanguaging is natural while multilanguaging is political. I'll be building on these 3. Okay, the first thing what I wanted to say is that, when I look at the language data and try to abstract the language profile of the country, or the way it has been abstracted by us in this country, I get 3 linguistic pictures. And this is very important to place it today. One, of course, is constructed by the Census of India. And what is the Census of India has done? It has, in 19th century, when we started the first census, we tried to, we asked, the question that what's your mother tongue? And of course, mother tongue was defined as the language that is spoken by the biological parents of the child. And then we carried out the linguistic survey part of the census, included information on on people's languages. And one of the major questions we asked was the mother tongue. And the recent most census, which is 2011 census, basically when we rationalized, when we asked questions about the language and languages that they speak, we got more than 19,000 language names. But when we rationalized using some of the linguistic principles and parameters, we got 1,365 languages, out of which 22 languages are, included in the 8th schedule of the Constitution, and 120, earlier it was 121, and now it is 120 languages where the languages spoken by more than 10,000 speakers, which are also included in the Constitution, but they were called non-scheduled languages. And beside that, you have several hundred languages that are spoken by less than 10,000 speakers. So census always gave us a picture where we count the languages in terms of names. How many languages are there? Who speaks what language? How many speakers are there of a language? That's one linguistic profile we have, picture that we have. The other linguistic picture is mediated by the Constitution of India, which has 8 schedules. And because the Indian states were created on the basis of language, so we needed the 8 schedule. It was very functional that time, and we had started with foreign languages, which had 12 languages on the basis of which states were created, but 2, Sindhi and Sanskrit, which were scheduled languages and had speakers, but were not the languages of any state. And then the number, the nest expanded. We included 4 more languages, and in the next stage we included another 4 languages. So the total count went up to 22 languages, and these 22 languages are used as major languages. Okay, you can go to the next one, which you were showing, major languages, and it was mandated, at the time of independence, that the official communication will be in the official works will be done in these languages, 8 scheduled languages. Of course, I don't want to get into that. That will take me away from our primary discussion. Initially, just to mention, we don't have any national language, but we had 2 official languages. English was to continue for 15 years. And we thought, it was discussed that once Hindi, everybody becomes little familiar with Hindi and develops some kind of, intelligibility in Hindi language, we will drop English from being official language, which never happened. And there was other kinds of politics, why, how North rejected the Southern languages rejected. It never happened, and so we continued with English. But then in the states, it was decided the education will be primarily, school education will be primarily in the region, language of the state. So in other words, language of the state was considered to be the default, quote unquote, mother tongue language, mother tongue of everybody, or at least it's called regional language, but it was assumed that everybody understands that language, and there, of course, lied a big problem. Okay, the third picture, linguistic picture, was given by the micro studies, which were carried by linguists and educationists in the name of sociolinguistic survey. Sociolinguistic survey gave a very different picture. And it's important to understand why we are discussing this. The sociolinguistic surveys often presented the actual linguistic complexity of the country. That multilingualism is actually commonplace. Everybody is a multilingual. Almost all the languages are are multilingual repertoire. And in our everyday linguistic practice, we either translanguage or multilanguage. You'll find that in many countries like Europe, translanguaging is, or plurilinguality is used much more. And in southern, say, African countries, in Asian countries, global south, we use the term multilingualism a little more, and also multilanguaging, because multilingualism is about ideology. So when I talk about language practices, then we use the term multilanguaging. At least I use the term multilanguaging. The difference between these two, other day Cynthia was saying that Europe is actually very, intrigued and also challenged by the difference between these two terms, because these two terms are used in, very in different parts of the world, and sometimes these two terms are competing with each other in, providing a pedagogic approach. So it's important how I look at these two terms, especially in these 3 studies that I carried out with some of my colleagues, is that translanguaging is natural. we are wired for language, and we are wired. We have the grammatical structures. I mean, language acquisition device, of course, Chomsky talks about. But if we do not get into those controversies of universal grammar and cognitive linguists' position on grammar, we at least agree on one thing, that we are wired for language, and we employ grammatical structures to use or speak a language, and almost all of us have a very expanded multilingual repertoire. When we speak, we use those linguistic resources or input or repertoire in constructing a sentence that is grammatically correct or consistent. Okay, and it is spontaneous because we are wired for it. It is part of our automatic or spontaneous action. Whereas multilanguaging is political because it is deliberative. When I know that this particular language is called Odia, and it has lexical or phonetic structure of this kind, which is different from, say, another language, say Saura, very significantly, but it is little similar to Bengali, but yet it is a different language. And there is a phonetic variation, continuity I see between these two languages, which is little more than the phonetic continuity I see between Odia and Saura. When that, that knowledge I have, and I use these linguistic repertoires in my everyday world, where I'm conscious of how I'm employing different languages or the linguistic inputs from different named languages, I call it multilanguaging, because that's deliberative, that's not spontaneous. But and that's the reason, multilanguaging, because it's conscious, it's part of my deliberate action. I am aware of also these switches I make between the languages, whether it is intrasentential or intersentential, whether I code switch or I code mix, I am conscious of my borrowings from different languages. What I found in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, also in Odisha, and you must be seeing in your everyday language, that we translanguage almost all the time. And in more official spaces like classrooms, where monolingualism is imposed on us, even if it's not natural, but it is ideologically imposed on us, we tend to multilanguage sometimes. So it's not that, this is not about this or that. Many scholars debate about that. What I argue in my paper and in all my works is that no, both are present. One is natural, I'm wired for it. The other one is, deliberative and is political. And look at the kind, and therefore, there is a particular kind of politics in deciding language planning and language pedagogy when I name the languages. Of course, there is another kind of politics which we are increasingly becoming aware of when I do not name the language, or I simply treat every language as a multilingual repertoire, and I promote translanguaging as a paradigm for classroom pedagogy. There is another kind of politics which I'll come to quickly, as quickly as possible, because I don't want to take more time. I'm just scared that I'll take away others' time. So why I'm discussing about this? Because in recent time, both internationally as well as in this country, we have encountered two kinds of pedagogic imaginaries. One that is founded on translanguaging, and the other that is founded on multilanguaging. And it's therefore very important to unpack these two. We are going to do it in one of our conference little more. And this today's and this is a very different kind of webinar, so we'll not have much time to deal with each concept in detail, which we'll do in our forthcoming conference. And we can have separate lectures on that also. But yes, these are the two kinds of pedagogic imaginaries we have, very competing. They have their own politics. And whenever we bring this together, there is another kind of politics that sets in. And I thought, therefore, it's important to talk about this too. This is, if you want to know a little more, my 2021 paper on chapter on the state, market and multilingualism has discussed this a little elaborately. Of course, I'll ask you to read 2-3 papers of mine to get a full view. And the recent one, where I talk about translanguaging is natural and multilanguaging is political. But otherwise, the 2021 paper discusses quite a bit. What I have discussed, which I want to place in front of you, is this, that yes, we all slip into translanguaging all the time. In fact, we don't slip into, we always translanguage. Okay, we multilanguage only when we have the knowledge of 2 or more languages. And we also assume that the interlocutors also has knowledge of 2 or 3 languages. It's not that the interlocutor is completely doesn't have any intelligibility of the 2nd or 3rd language that I am using. Okay, and the foundational, logic of translanguaging, a pedagogy founded on based on translanguaging is that everybody has an expanded multilingual repertoire. As we hear different lexical categories, hear sounds, we crack the structure of the sounds, we figure out that, okay, this is the way we speak in Odia, whereas in English we pronounce it differently. Also Hindi, we pronounce it differently. Or the sentences are constructed like this in Odia, whereas it is constructed like this in English. These are different languages. They have different sentential structures, different phonetic system. But as I hear them, what I develop is a common linguistic repertoire, which translanguage experts call multilingual repertoire. And so when the child is speaking, the child obviously employs one grammatical structure, and by the time the child is 3-4 years old and living in a multilingual society like ours, knows that the grammatical structures are different if the languages are different. They quickly figure out, and the language they speak, they acquire the linguistic structure and the grammatical structure of the language, and they use them to speak. Okay. But as they speak, using a particular sentential structure of that language that they speak in their everyday world, they show extreme amount of flexibility and fluidity in using the lexical categories from different languages. And when they have people speaking other languages, they also show tremendous amount of flexibility, which in actually using some of the phonetic inputs or bringing in some of the phonetic inputs or other structural inputs from the language in which the other person is good at or is familiar with, so that the mutual intelligibility is enhanced. But when they speak, they very freely and almost autonomously pick up from their multilingual repertoire. And that's very autonomous. So the pedagogy founded on translanguaging unfolds like this. In the classroom, we don't separate languages. What we do is we start the conversation depending on the familiarity of the students or what they bring into the classroom, the linguistic structure or the lexical categories or the phonetic inputs or variations, whatever they bring in, we try to use as effortlessly as possible to communicate with each other. And whatever results from that exercise, people understand because they constantly translanguage, interpret for each other. They try to study the linguistic behavior of the interlocutors and accordingly determine, and they do it instantly as if they're not planning. They just do it spontaneously, and they actually do it very, very effortlessly. And that, according to translanguage experts, should be the medium of instruction. And this, in my 2021 paper, what I was arguing was that in a country like India, where languages remain in a hierarchy, and a hierarchy of the kind where certain languages are not even considered as worth using in public domain by others. The language, the power gap is so huge. When we use translanguaging as a pedagogy, it may be used as a very, very tested tool for quick assimilation into the mainstream language. That is, it could be regional languages, or it could be English. It could be Hindi, Odia, Bengali, Hindi, English, because that's what America is doing. Why American society is called melting pot society, because finally you have to learn English, you have to get into American lives. So it finally melts you, into that mainstream language or mainstream society. You can stop the, you can actually, because I'm not reading from my documents. I had some quotes from my documents which were giving evidences for what I'm showing, but I don't need them. So what I fear is that the languages of children will enter the classroom, but they may exit very soon. As soon as the children learn the mainstream language, so the major languages, the teacher will switch quickly. And this switching is generally propelled by another tendency, that is of monolingualism. What is very powerful in terms of ideology is this monolingualism. And a lot of education administrators and teachers believe in acquiring the languages of power, and definitely the language that the state speaks and English. So the tendency to switch to these major languages or more powerful languages is already there, and there is a kind of dominant, politically constructed monolingualism that has been there since past, since several thousand years, that will determine the speed at which the languages of children exit the classroom. Languages of children exist in both the paradigms. In the second paradigm, where we foreground it on multilanguaging, so we say that, okay, children speak different languages, their familiarity with different languages is of different kinds. So let's start with children's languages and then gradually move to the state language, but also continue with children's languages. We talk about use of these languages both in oral and in written form, part of the curriculum to be carried out in children's familiar or stronger languages. You may call it mother tongue, but stronger languages. And then gradually we move to the regional language and English. And idea, actually, what we argue that, no, let the children's languages continue as long as possible. Okay, but here we talk about use of children's languages both in writing and also in oral domain. We also talk about using children's strongest or home languages as medium of instruction in the classroom. Medium of instruction is a bad word, like I'm not saying medium of instruction, but those languages should be also used as their languages. They don't lose their identity in the larger a framework of, say, translanguaging. Or when we use the term translanguaging, many times these languages lose their identity to the dominant language, especially in the classroom context. So there is a trap in both the paradigm. The trap in the second paradigm, that is where it is founded on multilanguaging, is of this kind, that Indian classrooms are extremely multilingual. In every classroom, you find children speaking 5, 6, 10 languages, or mother tongues at least. So how many languages you use as medium of instruction, how feasible it will be to use, how many are you going to develop textbooks and other materials in 8 or 10 languages? That's the challenge. And therefore, what is the way out? And many times, what happens is that we quickly switch to a bi or trilingual mode. And when we switch to a bilingual or trilingual mode, we anyway leave out another 5, 6, 7 languages which are spoken by not a significant number of the class, but definitely by some children. Okay, so we have the added burden of developing textbooks in many languages or teaching learning materials in many languages, using them as languages in the classroom. So some kind of, building a pedagogy of switching between languages. You call it code switching or whatever, but we switch between languages, and the burden of that paradigm, is realized in ways like this, that in how many languages you develop materials, or how many languages you employ for instructions, and how far do they go in the domain of reading and writing. Okay, the other one, translanguaging, where also we use children's multilingual repertoire, both in speaking as well as in writing, but gradually we move to the language of the state. And of course, it stays open. It says that, the linguistic flexibility should be maintained in the classroom, even if the major language is the primary, one in a class in a pedagogy founded on translanguaging. Some states, some countries, what they have done to make things a little more easy, and other day Chinran was telling me, he'll discuss probably today, that when the question of scaling comes, how this practicality, the logic of administration actually dominates, and it might push us to use children's languages, their mother tongue or first or the strongest languages in the oral domain and in the early years, but gradually move towards more use of the regional language and English, and of course use the regional language strictly in the written domain. I don't know, that Dheer will discuss in his session how the country is thinking of addressing the question of scaling up, and also extreme and the complex multilinguality that we have in our classrooms, and also how far we are going to surrender to the administrative logic founded on feasibility. I think Dheer is best equipped to do this. I will just stop drawing your attention to one or two small things very quickly, and then we can switch over to Cynthia. In this country, if it is pedagogy, we can talk for hours and hours. That's our area of expertise, but we'll refrain from that today. I just want to have a little historical reflection here. If we look at the language of discourse, the language of reform discourse, educational reform discourse in this country, what we find is that we are almost moving in a circle. There is a kind of circularity. And when we never escape that, what we left 30 years back, we go back to that. Teaching in mother tongue is not new. Constitution said it. 365 article A, read that. It says that primary education should be in mother tongue. 1966 policy, 3 language formula, and 1985, 86 policy, all talked about teaching children in primary classes in their mother tongue. But look at how we are going about. We are going again and again in circle, partly because we always lose what is called historical time. Because we are in a hurry to implement, we want a feasible program, and therefore we ignore what will be intellectually, pedagogically, and pedagogically sustainable, and what will meet rightfully the needs, the academic as well as social political needs of children and adults. Even if the process is slow, we have to follow that line. The historical time has told us that wherever we try to get into a very quick process, we return back to the original position. And therefore, reform, we never proceeded. Okay. Okay. And there are different kinds of
Ma'am, you are not audible.
Your mic is off, ma'am.
Minati, you need to unmute yourself.
There's something going wrong. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay. So what I wanted to end with, is that I see an urgency. Of course, this new understanding of multilingualism, which is derived from the third picture, like where from the grassroots level work, like Cynthia will present, the actual multilingual practices of people and children. It's not that it's new, but the state is now talking about it and is ready to build on it. That is very new in that sense, not new as a form of knowledge, but new as being one of the driver of our new pedagogic initiatives or reform. And so therefore, I'm actually hoping to see something better, something deeper, and something closer to the actual language practices of people. Okay, what I would warn against is 3-4 things I'll warn, and I'll stop there. One is that a very high-paced, quick solution. Our historical time has told us, what I was saying, has told us that the moment we ignore the actual needs of children and the state, the people, the groups, not the state, the group, we will again return back to the original position. I don't want that. Let it be slow, but let it be stable, and let's evolve with a very strong paradigm. The second, see what will kill multilingual education tomorrow. It'll draw its deathbed, I'm telling you. It'll lay its deathbed, is privatization. Health and education should remain primarily in the public domain. The state has to, because, and of course, you read the NEP and look at the practice, forget about NEP, NEP is only a document. Look at the practices. We don't know how to challenge the monolingual ideologies of the private schools. We have no control over private schools. We have so little control over private schools that we won't be able to push this agenda further. Of course, there are many other reasons why I'll support state education, state-funded education. But if we are serious about multilingual education, please argue for state education and state-funded education. And of course, school closure will be one of the major challenges. We need schools closer to children. So we shouldn't, the kind of school closure debate I hear in Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Jammu Kashmir is actually very scary. I think that we should refrain from. Third, if we talk about including every child in the classroom, we have to include their voices, their body, their emotions, and that's possible if we bring in the primary mediator of their mind, of their subjectivity, of their intellect, that is language, and that language needs to be recognized. So even if being a psychologist, I I accept both the terms, translanguaging and multilanguaging, but I accept translanguaging as a natural phenomenon and multilanguaging as a political phenomenon. But I foresee, I mean, I would argue that we decide our politics of language practices in classroom and language pedagogy, and not be determined by others. We rather see what is best for us, where every child is recognized for his knowledge, for his intellect, for his creativity, and for his own body. See, my body is language. How can my voice, my body, if I don't bring these two to classroom, if these two are not recognized in the classroom, I'm not recognized. I'm always an outsider in that classroom. So if I want truly an inclusive paradigm, I think we need to go deep into, I'm not giving any solution. Let's together dialogue and find out a good solution. What I will do, being an academician, I will reflect at how concepts and ideas work, what understanding they give me, and what are the challenges I face, and especially in the politics of school education. The politics of school education is about monolingualism. That, if I'm talking about ism, that is dominant. Three language formula could not challenge that ism to a large extent for various reasons. I don't want to get into that. But what I am saying, that now that translanguaging is accepted officially as a language practice, and multilingualism is about politics of power, about politics of visibility, about predatory field getting created because of the domination of so-called major languages. And also we have the history of how languages, hundreds and thousands of languages, have been minoritized in this country. Even the languages spoken by numerical majority are minoritized in this country. So if we have those historical knowledges, we have to discuss and debate what solution we need for this country. I don't have any solution for you. I shouldn't give you any solution. So now I look forward to other three. I took more time, I know. I look forward to other three speakers. They might give you some solutions. So I'll stop here. Nikita, you can invite other speakers to speak. I'm really sorry I took more time. How much time did I take? Oh my God, I took much more.
Now I invite Dr. Cynthia Groff to please begin with her talk.
All right. Trying to share my screen here and still see what you're seeing. That's a little hard for me here. What are you seeing now? Are you seeing me?
Yeah, we can see you, and we can see the screen as well.
If you go into the slide mode.
Yes, thank you.
Then you'll have a full screen actually.
So
slideshow mode. Go to the slideshow mode.
Yes. Okay. So now you're seeing me and my PowerPoint, I think. Correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. How you teach? So one thing that's interesting in doing research on language and language speakers is that everybody has an opinion about language. Everybody speaks a language and everybody has an opinion about language. And so it's not just about language practices, it's also about our beliefs about languages and these ideologies that we carry around with us about language. And that's very much influenced by language policies, and the policies themselves are influenced by ideology also. So these three things are coming together: language practices, language ideologies, language policies. But let me ask you, in this picture that I took, was I standing on a hill or was I standing on a mountain? I think we know this to be the Himalayan foothills. So yeah, is it a hill? But I live in the Netherlands now. And in the Netherlands, what they call a mountain is just a tiny little bump in the land. So yeah, these definitions are obviously artificial from place to place. And what's under those clouds there? I mean, we know that there are hundreds of villages down in there under that cloud cover. And what is actually going on down there in those villages? So that was, what I went to the Komani for my dissertation research. And that was, oh, wow, was it 15 years ago already? So it's been quite some time. But I'm happy to be able to pull this back up and talk about what I saw there, just looking at the experiences of young women, the girls at the school where I was staying. I lived with some girls at Lakshmi Ashram up in Komani, and I shared life with them. I ate with them, I peeled potatoes with them, and we talked about language. And I also visited the local villages and the local intermediate college, and just got to know Komanis and their own experiences of language for 9 months of field work. So I won't share my whole conceptual framing and all that, but Ecology of Language is one of the pieces of literature that I draw from, and we really care about the situation of language and how it relates with other languages and what's really going on. And for me, it was really important to listen to the voices of the women and the educators themselves and how they themselves were experiencing it. So an ecological approach does more than describe the relationship between the situated speakers of different languages. Rather, it is proactive and pulling apart perceived natural language orders. So we don't have to go over the numbers, obviously, you know them. And we just talked about that also. And it really depends who you're asking and how you're looking at all this multilingual variety in India. But today we're celebrating that diversity. And we're celebrating beyond just these named languages, also what's actually going on the ground, and what are people doing with language, and how is that affecting their identity and their beliefs about language. So let's go to the Komani and get to know some of these beautiful people and their experiences of language. So I think you know something of the Komani language situation. And when I talked to the locals about it, Komani was obviously our language. That was what they identified with. And Komani was used for daily life in the village. Also at the ashram where I stayed, it was the main language of communication. However, Hindi was right there beside it. And they considered that to be the national language and officially the mother tongue. They talked about Hindi as also our language, our culture. Sanskrit was also there as a root language, and our culture, our old times. That was also something that they expressed as their own. And then there was English. That's also a school subject alongside Sanskrit, and it's a little bit farther out there for the Komanis. It's an other language. It's an international language, and yet it's very important to them to be learning English. So as Manju said, in their own place, each is important. All of these languages are existing together in the school situation in the Komani. So let's look closer at this Komani Hindi connection. Because if you ask them for census purposes, what is the mother tongue, many Komanis will report Hindi as the mother tongue. And we see that in the census, Komani is counted under Hindi. One of the didis at the ashram told me, if we think about it, Komani is our mother tongue, but there are not books in Komani and it is not used in school. Hindi is considered to be the mother tongue. So there's some tension about what do we actually mean by mother tongue, by mother language. So I explored that a little bit more. I just kept asking different people in different contexts, what do you mean? What is a Pasha? And I came across this word boli. What is a boli? And why do we say that this is a Pasha and this is a boli? And it's sort of different than dialect. Dialect has a certain connotation, at least in English for me. And boli seems to exist there right alongside Pasha. So some of the reasons given for why you would call Hindi a Pasha is that it has a particular form. And we know internationally that you can't distinguish dialect from language based on linguistic form. I mean, it would be tidy to say, well, are they mutually intelligible or not? But actually, yeah, it's much more dependent on the social context, what you consider to be a language, what you consider to be a dialect. Is it used as a language? Like Didi said, is it used in school? Then it must be a Pasha. And does it have an official status? So there the Constitution comes in. Have we scheduled this as a language? And then it seems like it has some sort of status. Yeah, so through these kind of conversations, I think about mother tongue. There's an official mother tongue, Hindi, and there's an unofficial mother tongue, Komani. And then if you look at the school level, what's actually happening in the school, there's an official medium of instruction, generally Hindi, but then an unofficial medium of instruction when Komani actually comes in there as a support language. And yeah, we're obviously going to pick this apart in more detail, as Minati said later in this conversation. Then you go to English medium classrooms, and you see also the use of Hindi there. So there's a lot of ambiguity going on the ground. So Vaish was noticing this also. She said the dialect speakers consider themselves to be part of the great Hindi tradition and not in opposition to it. The dialect speaker is motivated to learn the standard language of prestige without suffering a loss of identity. So there's identity issues going on here. Also that, yeah, allow the Komanis to feel a part of the larger nation through claiming Hindi also as their own. So what about English? English is here alongside. And Saroj Didi said, nowadays people are going to English medium schools and English is the fashion. People speak English to make themselves high. And here she throws in the English word fashion in her quote. And I heard also from one of my girls at the ashram, Govandhi, she said, if someone doesn't know English, people think she doesn't know anything. That's how they think, no? And yeah, I'm sorry for this audience that I don't have the beautiful Hindi originals for you. These are my translations. So yeah, English is also important. Let's play a game. I said to the girls that were sitting around one afternoon and they were working on their knitting. And I said, what's the first thing you think of when you think of Komani? And all of the word associations that come up with Komani have to do with the village and a home and rows of houses. There's an image of a village that you think of. What do you think of when you think of Hindi? And they start listing language names. That's clear in that list. And now what do you think of when you think of English? And they start listing school subjects. So there's a clear distinction there for how they're thinking about these different languages. That was fun. So how do all these different languages and varieties interrelate with each other? As I went around the Kumaun asking about these things, I often heard this famous line, Kos kos per barle pani, char kos per bani. And so the water tastes different from village to village, and also the speech changes. And this is something that was told to me in a positive way, that they're proud of this this variety from village to village. It has value to them. And as we heard one of the girls saying, in their own place, each is important. So this valuing, let me take it down to Govandhi and how she described it. She had to learn Komani when she went to the home village. She moved with her family from a Hindi-speaking area back to the Kumaun, and she realized that on the ground, Komani was important. But when I asked her to compare the local environment, the trees, with the local languages, the pine trees are dominant there, and they tend to obliterate the mixed forests. And Govandhi says, there are lots of pine trees here, so that would be Komani. But no, if we take all of India, it would be English, because English is the international language. In India, English is first, and then Hindi is second, and then the other languages. She's laying out for you here a clear hierarchy in her mind, like Minati just mentioned. The hierarchy exists and we can't deny it. So she also feels very strongly that there should be a place for Komani. She says in Hindi, they say that Komani is dirty. Chi, who speaks it? Nobody knows it. We will speak English. And they are content speaking English, but that's wrong. Learn Komani also. That is also our language. When you go outside, speak Komani. And with those who speak Hindi, speak Hindi. And in big society where people don't speak Hindi and you have to use English, then use it. No? Throwing away one thing and taking up another isn't good. Yay, Govandhi, I agree with you. We can have these side by side, right? So some of my other girls also repeated this idea that multilingualism is valuable. For us children, we should not only know Komani for going to school, we should also know Hindi, and for school, we should also know English. Like in Hindi, we mix English right in between. That's how they use it. The word just comes sometimes, right? And here she's throwing in these English words in her own explanation of how things work. This is happening quite naturally. So I'm going to throw this very dense slide in here, not to go down over it in detail, but just to remind us, like Renati said, this is not new. We have been talking about this for quite a while, and it's gaining a lot of popularity internationally, this translanguaging, and then the more practical steps to how to implement multiple language resources in the classroom. All of these things are really getting attention around the world. And this is something that has been a matter of attention in India for quite some time. And I'm just happy to see more practical steps being taken in this direction, and we're looking for ways to make it work. So I'm looking forward to what the rest of you have to say about this. Let me just pull out the quote right there in the middle from Kupchandani. The literate world seems to be circumscribed by the myth of treating language in everyday life as a crystallized entity characterized by a distinct tradition embodied in its literary heritage. We have this idea that languages have to be counted and named, and in fact, as Agnihoshri pointed out, language is essentially a constantly changing phenomena. And any classroom in India is in general multilingual, as you know. This has been quick, and I did it quick on purpose because I know that our other speakers have a lot of really practical things to share. But before I close, I just want to tell you about my visit to Kumail University. I got to go to both Nainital campus and Almora campus several times. And I was at the Almora campus one afternoon, and I climbed down the steep hillside, you know, the zigzag path, steep down the hillside to the English department. And I had been invited to come and chat with and hear from a group of future English teachers. They're in a bachelor's program for future English teachers. And so I wanted to know their opinions of all of these language issues in the Kumail, and it was fun to chat with them. But as I talked with them, I noticed something. There were a few very fluent English speakers who were responding and engaging with me in this dialogue. And there was a large majority of the class that wasn't as engaged. And I also noticed their teachers started to paraphrase for me in Hindi. And I caught on and I said, oh, I can be using a bit more Hindi in this conversation. So in retrospect, I wished I had done it sooner, but I started to just switch a little bit and use a bit more Hindi in the conversation. And I was wishing I had done that more because I saw the social tension building between these Hindi medium kids and these English medium kids. And I think this may be familiar to you in your university contexts, that there's this social divide that's not common in other parts of the world. And the English teacher told me later that as she started out in this course, teaching this course, she had been using English exclusively with them. And one day she came into the classroom and she saw written across the board these words, please use mother tongue. And that's when she had her aha moment. Oh, my students want me to be using more Hindi in this classroom. And yeah, I'm glad they had the courage to speak up about that and say that this was important to them. And yeah, I wrote a bit more about that, and they wrote some essays for me also on what they would do in their English classes. What would they do? Would they be using English only? Would they be using Hindi? Would they actually be using some Komani also to engage students? These are issues worth discussing. Please use mother tongue. So, like I said, this is not something new. And in the Kumail, this diversity seems to be valued, and it doesn't seem to be a threat to identity, to be able to identify with these different Pasha and Boli. And what we're looking at now is more conscious and careful use of the students' linguistic resources in the classroom. And this is being explored worldwide and in depth here in India. So I'm looking forward to what the rest of you have to say about this. And please email me if you want to see any of my papers or references.
Nikita, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much, Dr. Groff, for such an insightful presentation. And should we invite the next speaker, ma'am?
Yes, Professor Mohanty, I think is
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now I would request Professor Ajit Mohanty to please begin the talk.
Sir, unmute yourself. Muted, sir. You are muted. You are muted, sir. You
Well, I just want to say that let Dhir Jhingran present past before I come in, because I'm just excused myself from another webinar with Toves Putnam-Kangas, Robert Phillipson and myself as the speakers. It was being organized by the Maulana Azad Urdu University, Aligarh Muslim University and others. So let me gather myself and while Dhir continues his talk. Let him speak and then I'll come back.
Okay, so I would like to invite Dr. Dhir Jhingran to please begin the talk. Sir, can you hear me?
I think others can unmute themselves. Please mute yourself, except Dhir, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Should I be speaking now? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what Professor Mohanty is requesting you to do. He just finished another webinar.
Oh, okay.
He wants to gather his ideas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we can have your talk before him.
Okay. Let me just try and share my screen if that works. Having a lot of problem. Can you see my screen right now?
Yeah, we can see your screen, sir.
Okay, yeah, okay. Let me try and see, make it full screen. Okay, so Minity was saying, I'm going to say something a little different. And basically talk about what can happen, we are trying to do at scale in terms of including children's home or familiar languages. And here, of course, it is all the constraints that are there have been taken into account. And Minity, of course, said that we should not be constrained by feasibility, administrative or otherwise. But we also know that. So what I'm going to describe is what can happen at scale, given administrative acceptance, but also language situations. Variants, for example, I'm going to describe what we're doing in a Wagadi speaking area in southern Rajasthan, where there are variants of Wagadi. And as everyone says, difficult to even give language labels, but somewhere more influenced by Gujarati, somewhere more by Mewari, Hindi, etc. And that these are the situations. So even within a block, you find the nature of Wagadi spoken, the acceptance of Wagadi, Hindi, etc. varies a lot. And of course, the aspirations for Hindi and English. And knowing that a mother tongue based MLE, which is of course the gold standard, late exit or no exit if possible, until at least grade 8 is the best way of doing things. But we also know that the only state with a language policy, Orissa, actually has managed to do this in 3,000 schools over 20 years. And so therefore, what we do is, what we advocate for is mother tongue based MLE, for example, in Chhattisgarh, in Halbi, that's what we are doing. But alongside another strategy, and I'll skip all of this. I was talking about language practices in general, but I'll skip all of that. What we're trying to do is just give you a flavor now of a classroom in Chhattisgarh, where the teacher includes Chhattisgarhi and children speak naturally, as Minati was saying, translanguaging, natural use of your repertoire of language for best expression. This is something we try and work towards. I hope you can listen to it also.
दरिया में कूद कूद के कौन नहाए फुजल ते हर कति घाट में कूदे रहे
छोकरा घाट
तो तौरे पर आते तौरे पर आते
आथे सर
हैं नारवा में जात रहो तौरे पर नहीं आई तो किसे करियो
ट्रैक्टर का वो फुगा बदल रहता है ट्रैक्टर का ट्यूब सर उसमें उफल जाएंगे ये सब
अब मान लो ट्यूब भी नहीं हुई तब किसे करियो
सर लकड़ी
सोनी बताते
सर लकड़ी पे बैठेंगे तो ऐसे ऐसे करेंगे तो जाएंगे लकड़ी लाओ उसको बांध दो और चलते चलो ये लकड़ी नहीं में डुबकी भागेगा
ऐसे यहाँ हाँ चाप थे जी बिलाई है
मछली ला कुदाती
ऐसा
पानी में उड़ाती
हाँ बिल्ली के काले बच्चों ने तालाब में एक मछली देखी और उन्होंने तालाब में छलांग लगा दी जंप छलांग है ना आ रही है तब तो उन्होंने ला मुला
चाटने के मन है
Sir, we can't hear you.
Muted. Dhir. Dhir. Dhir, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Then you are not audible. Can you please unmute yourself again? Because it sometimes goes into the mute mode automatically.
When the videos are played, sometimes it does. It shows muted sign there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I've actually just removed the external speaker. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
Okay. So basically, this is something which is, we don't call it either translanguaging or multilanguaging. For children, whatever is natural works best. And for teachers, of course, there is an effort to see how they can use various languages, as Miniti said, within a sentence, across sentences, to ensure that children understand and reinterpret what they're saying. So that's the example of what we are trying to do. I'll skip this also. What is our bottom line, even though we are not changing the medium of instruction in these schools? This is the example I'm taking right now, which we are trying to do at scale. As I said, we do smaller programs where it is mother tongue based multilingual education. But the non-negotiables are that children's languages must be valued, must find place in the classroom. We must begin with the home language, an extensive use of the home language. Languages not in watertight compartments, fluid and mixed use of languages, and of course, using children's home language across home language and other languages across all subjects. That's the bottom line of any program that we do. And as we've been discussing, I'm talking about this second bullet here. L1 is used and developed throughout the primary grades in a strategic manner, at least in the oral domain, but often with reading and writing as well. The official medium of instruction remains Hindi, that's the language. So that's the example I'm taking here now. This is what we are doing in that area. So Vagni is used extensively and strategically throughout the primary grades up to grade 5. We don't work beyond grade 5, so we're not able to influence that. And this somewhat relates to what Miniti was saying about natural and planned. I mean, while the curriculum does some planning, but the idea is that teachers allow a natural use of language while they do some kind of planned use of mix of languages. And just to say very quickly, a strong focus on building on children's orality and of course, using local context, culture and children's knowledge. I mentioned the natural mixing of languages and also, of course, good second language teaching strategies using L1 as well. And of course, across the curriculum. We follow a balanced literacy approach, but there's not enough time to go into this now, but this is the overall approach. And if I was to say, I think I'll just take the next slide. The broad strategies, because I was asked to give a flavor of what happens inside the classroom. In the first 4 or 5 months, teaching and interaction happens in the home language through a lot of read aloud, storytelling, poems, posters, rhymes, action songs. While there will be some limited use of Hindi for TPR, for learning some verbs and nouns, but otherwise that's the first thing. And of course, there are poem posters and story posters inside the classroom, a lot of it around the classroom. Then, as I said, this is the planned use of home and school language. Again, not planned centrally by us, but through the extensive interaction with teachers around multilingual awareness, understanding what children know, what they can express themselves, what is their, how much do they comprehend of Hindi. There is an attempt to use a balanced use of home and school languages, especially, for example, new or difficult concepts, higher order thinking and expression in grade 2, 3 also continues to be always in the home language when introduced. And then if there is a simple discussion, there's a yes and no, simple concept, then children could respond. The teacher could also ask a question in Hindi. So this is a very one simple example, but through the training, we discuss a number of ways in which the teachers could use home and school languages in a very strategic manner as appropriate. As I mentioned, we call it mixed language. So children speak in the home language, teachers respond in a mix of school and home language, and completely agree that home and school languages are not defined. It's whatever language is there in that classroom. Children, of course, use a mix of languages for better expression and communication. And teacher then tries to see how she could adjust the use of these languages as they go along. So, but it's always, the classroom is always a mixed language use classroom. That's the other strategy that we advocate for. We also use this for reading and writing to a limited, in a limited manner, as I said. For example, all the decoding work, which is done through workbooks, uses visuals and words that are all local, all Vagri. Of course, Vagri is varied. So trying to get words that are common, which can be used at least across one block has also been a challenge, but doing that. And of course, wherever children write in a mixed form, that's, teachers accept that at least until grade 2 and 3. And of course, as I said, Vagri is available in the classroom through posters and poems, etc. The most important one is this one for us, which is that all the materials that exist, posters, poems, charts, workbooks, and the classroom conversation is around local culture and knowledge, which children are very familiar with. So that is very good ground for children to be able to then express themselves, develop their orality, and then, of course, learn new words. Also in Hindi, because there is a total physical response kind of action songs and rhymes going on for 5 minutes or 10 minutes a day. And the teaching and learning materials also include a lot of these local contexts. And all of it is then connected to the curriculum. We've been lucky that the materials are all prepared by us, at least for grades 1 and 2, and to a large extent 3 as well. So the textbook is used very sparingly if there's an interesting story that can be read aloud by the teacher. Usually what happens is that there are big books, and the big books are read aloud in Vagri with a lot of conversation, discussion, dialogue with children, prediction about what's going to happen, very, very active, interactive classrooms. And then sometime later, a few months later, the same book, the same story could be visited in Hindi, where the teacher then goes slowly, reads aloud, and initially starts with very simple, yes and no type of questions, literal answers, till children can understand, some higher order questions. So the idea is to have the same concepts, the same ideas, the same stories happening both in Vagri and Hindi with a gap of time. And of course, as I said, some very specific work towards learning of Hindi, at least vocabulary, and trying to make Hindi simple whenever it is. So whenever there's a story, the story will be with gestures, with actions, and in a very simple language. We use a 4-block model, not to say that these 4 blocks are different chunks of time in the classroom, but the idea is this, that all of these things should happen in the classroom. As most of you are aware, our language classrooms really focus mostly on decoding, and reading, writing is mostly copying. And in the name of reading, usually it is the teacher reading out and there's choral repetition happening. So the idea is to get a balance around this, and a lot of reading. I don't have time to show the videos, but where there's a lot of reading by children in groups and pairs, with a lot of work on meaning making that happens. In writing, there's a lot of emergent writing, drawing, writing, what you think about a picture, and oral language, of course, is stressed a lot. So that's the 4-block model that we use. Just to give you a sense, I don't want to spend time on it, of what this is. Group A is basically, you can say, class 1, class 2, but there are some children from class 2 who are actually at a lower level, maybe sitting in class 1, especially as far as reading abilities. The attempt is to see that, as I mentioned, all of this happens. So there's storytelling, recitation, Vagri, big books, discussion. So the first 50 minutes in the phase 1 is all oral work. And then there's emergent writing on the big books. Children draw, they look at the big books, they spend some time with the books, some phonological awareness. And as you can see at the bottom, some oral games to develop, 10, 20, 30, 50 words, nouns and verbs in Hindi. This is how the first 4 to 6 weeks would look like. As you proceed further, Vagri continues. There's some poem recitation that's added in Hindi. There is a Hindi big book. The discussion, as I said, would be largely around in Vagri initially. And if there are some literal questions, they could be responded to in Hindi. drawing work continues, decoding work begins. And so that's the kind of, this is the flow of how the year happens for these two groups together. The oral language, if you can see at the top, happens with both classes together, so that there is a lot of interaction. And of course, it's a multi-grade situation. One teacher's grades 1 and 2 in Rajasthan sit together actually in the same space. So to try and see what work can be done together by each group. To close, just saying that what goes behind all this is a detailed curriculum, a sort of a week-wise guidance, not very prescriptive, but week-wide guidance of what materials can be used, and a lot of interaction with teachers around multilingualism, around Wagadi use, what can happen with Hindi, how should you encourage the use of Wagadi, Hindi, as children feel most comfortable doing. These messages are reinforced throughout trainings as well as regular monthly meetings. There's discussion with parents and local community around how children are learning. So a lot of, there's a program structure around this. So I'll stop here. This is the overall program that we think can be implemented at scale. Of course, very imperfect in terms of understanding of how and children's languages can be used as official mediums of instruction. But we've seen how classrooms change completely, as you saw in that one video, where children are so active and interacting a lot. But yes, as Miniti was saying, there is a risk of targeting of the standard language at school sooner rather than later. It hasn't happened in an area that we are working, but that risk is definitely there. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Jigran, for an informative presentation. Now, I would like to invite Professor Mohanty to begin with his talk, and afterwards we'll be taking any questions and comments from the audience.
Are you muted, Professor Mohanty? We can't hear you.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, greetings to all of you of the International Mother Language Day. I'm sorry I had to come in late because there was another program, webinar in which I was participating. But I'm glad that I didn't miss the major part of Cynthia's and Dheer Jingran's presentation. In fact, I attended the whole of it. I missed part of Minati's presentation. I think considering all that, that has been said, I would focus on two aspects on this International Mother Language Day. One is the whole idea of mother tongue. And the second would be more focused on classroom practices with linguistic diversity or multiple language used in the classroom. Now, when it comes to mother tongue, I have always held the view, right after the NCF 2005, I have been dealing with the National Curricular Framework and critiquing that. One of the things I said that mother tongue is actually a child's, the community's self-ascription. Each community has its own identity tagged to a language. When Cynthia's work actually talks about Komani being our language, that's it, that's how we define. Linguists may go on debating about the status of a language or mother tongue. Pennycook and Makoni, and to some extent Ramakant Agnihotri in India, do talk about non-entity of language being a non-entity, an invented category. I will not debate on that. I will not debate on the linguistic, theoretical, philosophical, linguistic debate on mother tongue or on language. I would focus more on what Cynthia says, a folk conception of our language. That is number one. In fact, I am writing a paper. I just sent it, actually completed the paper and sent it for editorial views, where I'm questioning the idea of language being an invented category or non-entity and so on the basis of two things. One is the identity notion. If you go back to Tobes Kutnap-Kanga's definitions of mother tongue, she talks about 4 different criteria. Origin, the first language that the child or a person learns, then the identity, both internal and external identity, as well as identification of a community by a language, and then talks about functions and competence, all of which actually go to say that the whole idea of mother tongue is extremely flexible. True. Languages, mother tongues are extremely flexible, fluidity across one or the other. But at the same time, if I accept the fact that language or mother tongue is linked intrinsically to the identity of a community or of a speaker, who am I to question that? I think the priority must go to the language user, regardless of what linguists debate about and regardless of how linguists view this thing. That's why, when I was writing this paper, where basically looking at the nature of mother tongue, the second strand of work which I sorry. Okay.
I think he got disconnected. He'll come back.
Okay, can you now hear me? I'm sorry, I seem to be in something wrong with, I'm using an iPhone now because I was tired of using the computer the whole day. There are 2 webinars I had been attending, so I thought I would pick up my iPhone, but I made that's probably wrong. Can you hear me now, Minati? Okay. Now there are 2 strands, as I was telling you. One is the communities or language users' self-ascription identity associated with mother tongue. The second is, springs from our work on multilingual socialization, in which I have shown that children develop not only perception of their own language, but differentiation of different languages in their surrounding through the process of their multilingual socialization. So children do actively differentiate despite the fact that language categories are fluid, despite the fact that one language extends into the other in actual use, children do differentiate languages. And I, therefore, on the basis of that work, I have argued that mother tongue and language is a psychological reality. Whether you linguists talk about the linguistic defensibility of the criteria of the concept of a language or mother tongue, regardless of that, I think it is important to recognize that language is a psychological reality. Now, in developing this work, trying to sort of restate my position on what is mother tongue, I again leaned heavily on two sources. One is this book which Cynthia has presented. I was privileged not only to be associated in various capacities with Cynthia's excellent ethnographic work in Komani languages and Komani region. And also I had the privilege of reading this excellent book of hers, The Ecology of Language in Multilingual India, because I had written a back cover blurb for the book, and therefore I had a preview of the book. And then recently writing this chapter where I wanted to establish the notion of mother tongue as a psychological reality. I fell back on this excellent work and description by Cynthia of how the Komani people perceive their own language, Hindi, English, Sanskrit, and all other languages. I have extensively used from that to justify the nature of perception of mother tongue among the folk. The other source, again, is another speaker present today. Excellent and very exhaustive, I would say, 3 sociolinguistic surveys and the monographs by Minati in Rajasthan area, in highly multilingual areas of Rajasthan, the villages and the classrooms. In both these works, Cynthia's as well as Minati's, they talk about the folk level, children level perception of languages, interrelationship between languages and so on. Therefore, I think it would be, if you put all the work together, Cynthia and our presentation today, as well as the book, and Minati's sociolinguistic survey and many other work which are available in India and other multilingual societies, it is probably necessary to reaffirm the reality of mother tongue, and because there are 2 things. One is anything other than that, denial of mother tongue would amount to excluding certain speakers from the mainstream processes of education and all that, and I think that would be wrong. And second part is the practicability of it, practicability of realizing that mother tongues are necessary part of a child's language environment and all that. And we have written a paper recently on how children in multilingual societies move from their home language use to languages of wider communication, where we have also brought in the language multilingual socialization work together. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that we should not dispel just because of the work by Pennycook and others, and also to some extent Ramakant's work, very influential, persuasive work, but I would still think that there is a need to reaffirm the status of mother tongue. And those of you who are engaging, actually, there is a lot of discussion on translanguaging and the recent debate about the translanguaging unitary, what Jim Cummins talks about, the unitary translanguaging theory, and then what he says the cross-linguistic translanguaging theory, and a lot of debate about that. Opelia Garcia, which I know in the same group of people, Alistair Pennycook, Makoni, and many others are sort of coming in to sort of deny this role of mother tongue, the role of children's language proficiency, and the translanguaging practices and all that, because if you deny the existence of language, many things would stand denied. I would request particularly the students here or researchers to read this very recent book just published maybe a few months back by Jim Cummins, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, published by Multilingual Matters. Jim Cummins, whether or not you agree with him is not the question. The question is, Jim Cummins is extremely thorough in reviewing the literature and talking about different translanguaging theories and versions, and then trying to integrate it to the existing the practices in multilingual education and so on. So I think I would strongly recommend. I'm still in the process of reading this book, but it's essential. So that's the first part of it. The second part, which again very excellent work and conceptualization of multiple languages in the classroom, and the whole idea of presenting children with comprehensible input and using children's mother tongue, I would again say mother tongue, to scaffold learning of other languages and scaffold school learning. Excellent work. In fact, some time back, Minati and I, we did look into the classroom practices, the multilinguality in the classroom practices, how children as well as teachers fell back on the children's mother tongue in teaching English and teaching other subjects. In fact, we have a paper, myself, Minati, and Rasim Pal, yes, in which we have described the multiple language context in the classroom, or multiple language used in the classroom as the practices. Now, excellent research since 2007 in teaching English as a second language, foreign language, and whatever, and in other areas, which say the same thing that Dhir Jhingran actually demonstrated in the work that they are doing. That is, use children's familiar language, or I would say mother tongue, to scaffold learning both classroom and scientific concepts, and also learning of languages, dominant languages like Hindi and others. This is being done. This is being extensively since 2007. Lot of English language teaching practitioners and researchers are actually talking about using mother tongue in the classroom in order to facilitate learning of English. But the only thing that we need to be careful about is that when you allow the teacher to use children's own language and all that, yes, teachers do have freedom. Teachers have great insight into how languages are used by children and how do they move from one language to the other. But I think this has to be a little more systematic practice. I'm all for comprehensible input. I'm all for using children's mother tongue or their familiar languages to scaffold classroom learning of classroom concepts as well as other dominant languages. So extensive use of home language is definitely necessary. It is productive. But what I would like to see is a greater level of systematization of that entire process and theorization of that process. There have been some excellent work on what is called identity text. There are books, I think at least one book on with that title, and Jim Cummins also in this book I just talked about, he also talks about identity text. What they are doing is, you can bring in multiple language children. And I visited one of the schools in suburbs of Toronto, in, I think, Mississauga area, where they bring in children, Gujarati speaking children, Hindi speaking children, Urdu speaking children from Pakistan, Cantonese speaking Chinese immigrants, children and all that. And they bring them and encourage all the children to use their own mother tongue, in whatever they produce. They can tell stories, they can write something in where they are free to bring in their own language as well as the mother tongue and all that. And that is the basis on which Jim Cummins and others have talked about the identity text. So what they are doing is they're developing a set of theoretical principles around use of identity text. Sometime back, working with the Care India group for their school for out of school girls in Odisha, I had suggested, because what we did is we did a language mapping of the classroom. We found 7 to 9 languages present in the classroom. So I advised them to use this identity text technique in order to sort of develop a child's identity in her own mother tongue and use that to scaffold learning. So I would say, yes, this is a great work that Dhir Jingran is doing, but I think that work needs to be more systematized, need to be presented and become a part of the curriculum of language teaching that our teachers are trained in. That's one very unfortunate part of Indian situation, where teacher training is perhaps one of the weakest. Therefore, we need to emphasize that. The whole traditional idea of a medium of instruction in the classroom, medium of instruction, I think that term should be replaced by what I have been recently writing about, medium of thinking. The medium of thinking of a child is perhaps the closest to something that deserves to be considered as a medium of teaching. And therefore, we need to systematize this and need to reassert the pedagogical benefits and the uses of mother tongue to scaffold better classroom learning and all that. I think I would stop here and thank the organizers for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for an insightful lecture. Now, I would request audience to, if they want to speak, they can raise their hand, or they can just write questions in the chat box or any comments that they have.
They can also switch on their audio and video. Of course, I mean, once you allow, they can speak directly to speakers.
Yeah.
Questions and comments?
No, there are no questions in the chat box. There's one. Yeah, there's one question. Yeah, there's one question. So, how multilingual impact on socialization of school children? What will happen if the teacher teach to students in the classroom without using mother tongue? So it's a question by Kartik Barat. Kartik, would you like to speak and ask the question yourself?
I'm just trying to get the question.
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah,
Good evening, everyone. My question is how multilingual impact on socialization of school children?
Can you elaborate on that question?
Yeah, because we're not getting the question. Just elaborate it a bit.
Yeah, if the teacher use multilingual, like it use different language to teach the students, then how it will affect that language, or it will help to help for socialization of children in a proper way, or in a proper manner.
Okay, I think this whole category of languages, how would a child deal with that, is a typically pedantic linguistic educator's view of what should be the language in the classroom. The point is, child in using language, you observe, we have done some observation of children playing with each other in multiple language groups, playing with each other and using languages, whatever they feel comfortable with, to communicate with each other. Therefore, that is not a problem for children. It's a problem for us adults, problem for teachers who are wedded to the idea of a medium of instruction or that kind of thing, So the point is, as Dheer, I'm sure Dheer would come in here, when Dheer talks about providing comprehensible input, what is more important is make the child comfortable, understand what you are trying to communicate, and make the child feel comfortable and with her own linguistic identity. That the language or languages that a child brings to the school situation is not to be devalued, is extremely important. Therefore, it's not a question of which language would teacher use. No, the question is to, as they said, comprehensible input. Engage with the child in whatever language or languages she feels more comfortable with, and that's the first most important pedagogic strategy in a classroom. I'm sure they would like to come in and reflect on that this question.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Dr.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can just add briefly here. I think what we're talking about is, are the children going to hear enough of a good modeling of what we consider good standard language use? And this is a dilemma for many teachers, because they feel like the child needs to hear good standard language. And if we allow these other varieties and mixtures in, is that going to give them enough input? And this is the dilemma we're talking about.
May I just say a couple of sentences here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
So very true, Cynthia, what you said, and Professor Mohanty, the 2 points. One about this interference and corruption, this is very common, and the emphasis on purity of the standard language. And we've always had to struggle with this as a dialogue with teachers about what is most important. Children understanding, expressing themselves, making mistakes, which is all a part of the learning process. Or do you want from the beginning for them to be speaking correctly? Then they will not speak. And most classrooms, the question here where only the standard language is used, standard means the standard textbook language is used, are silent classrooms from children's side, because they've just realized that they should not speak, otherwise there'll be heavy-handed correction. So one of the most important things that we discuss with teachers is there is no need to correct. There is a need to allow children to express themselves in whatever manner they do. And you'll have enough time later to talk about what are correct pronunciation, correct words, etc. So that is a big struggle initially, and something we deal with it on every training, every meeting. This happens.
Can I also say something here? Karthik, one also needs to ask where from these fears come. In a playground, we don't seem to be carrying these fears, you know. When children speak in different languages, they do not speak in standard Hindi, we are not worried about, we are scared. We're not scared, but we get worried in the classroom. Okay, so whenever we address fears, we have to see where are they originating from. I think that's where the first level of analysis begins. And then you will be able to unpack several myths attached to how children learn and where does this whole idea of purity comes and why purity or standard speaking in a standard language early on is so important. I think if we do not look at the origin of fear, we'll not be able to address them substantively. So since you are pursuing, graduate program, I think at conceptual level, we should also ask this question, that why these fears and no other, not other kinds of fears, Yeah, I'll stop there. I just thought.
Sudeshji is asking a question.
Yeah,
I
will just show my face for a simple reason that so that Mr. Professor Mukhopadhyay and Mrs. Sudesh Mukhopadhyay should not be confused in the chat. I don't know why this background poster is coming from my whatsoever. What I want, I have pasted also something on that. According to me, the presentation, the summary, everything has been really eye-opening, and I am also learning many new things. But my whole thing is, when we talk about language, we talk about at the foundational stage, okay? When we are making a beginning. Then it comes a stage when it becomes purposive as we move in the higher sections. Mr. Jingran also, Dr. Jingran also said that just now whatever they are doing, it is more at the primary level. And as we were just having this webinar, I'm receiving a WhatsApp that something has been passed in the curriculum cabinet just now, and everything will be applicable to all types of school, including private schools and all those type of things. So that's why it becomes all the more important that after foundational learning, on which already under Nipun and all so many programs are going on, when the child start coming into the main, let's say class 3rd onwards, when the things get more formalized in all types of schools across the board, urban, rural, hilly, whatever terrain we are talking about. And third is the environment which a child gets. Because even in English medium schools, we always have these problems. If the child's home or the environment or the material to which he has or she has access to doesn't strengthen those languages, this problem. And this I have witnessed being both as a teacher in the rural school, also being a teacher educator for a long part of my life, that even with our adult students, they also go on facing the same challenge, which Cynthia also mentioned, that when you have in the same higher education institution, English medium sections and Hindi medium section, as a teacher educator, because at the initial stages, I had this problem. You talk in English and the Hindi section will say, Madam, aap to bahut zyada Angrezi bolti hai. So next time, because I have no problem with knowing many languages in which I can speak, if not read and write that fluently, I gave a lecture in 100% Hindi. So next day I had, Madam, thoda Angrezi bhi bataiye. Because today our language of communication, informal, informal, every situation is because even your Kamwala, who's not even at all educated, she will be using some of the English words, or even if she's Marathi speaking, she does. But most important thing is what we built up the attitude, number one, as far as the children are concerned, at the foundational stage itself. So that's why the type of work which Dr. Jingran has been sharing, or what Cynthia has been telling us, I really admire that it is purposeful. But in one of my studies, I find out what is the difference of the quality in a private school and government school. Why our government school? Because these schools, they do not care about what the timetable government is saying, and language and arithmetic, they get more periods in the initial stages as compared to what we do when the government school follow, because they are DO, they are headmaster, so many person. So the teacher autonomy, what policy talks about, but in practice, which is more needed at the foundational stage, sometimes it's not available, and that creates a problem, number one. Number two, once that attitude is made, then when I go to the next section, because each one of us is not lucky enough to be have exposure to pan India, to know so many languages and interact, because our all teachers will not have that background. So it means teacher education institution will have to simulate those type of situation. And I hope, and this NCF is being made along with NCRT and NCT becoming closer and universities having to play a role, we will be sensitive to put on these type of things in our both curriculum frameworks and other places, so that until unless as an adult I get exposed to those type of things, I cannot practice this in my classrooms, because I have seen Bagdi wala Jingran sahab aap bol rahe the, I travel in one of, and the thing, बच्चों को रास्ते से गाड़ी में बिठा लिया, okay, I'm passing that way, so I will drop you at the school, and they say, ये मैडम तो हमारी बहन जी जैसी बात करती हैं. I was wondering कि I'm traveling from Jodhpur to Barmer, I said बहन जी जैसी बात करती हैं, and then I understood that teachers were coming from Jodhpur to teach into that rural school, and her Hindi was different than the Hindi which those children do. And sometimes even the terms which we use, for example, Baiji is the most respected word in the Rajasthan community. And it is the most abused word when it comes to our say medias and some parts of the country where it is done more for the say prostitutes or those types. So once a boy asked us in Regional College Ajmer, after seeing that movie of Hema Malini or Rajesh Khanna, something, बहन जी ये बाई जी बहुत खराब शब्द होता है क्या? So I think as a teachers, we also need to understand that same gesture, same language conveys. And I will just cut it short here and say, I have posted how we also will have to take care of children with disabilities in our language classrooms, because the steps in language learning remains the same, but our multisensory approach, what in my language, we call it the universal design of learning, that also needed. So I have posted one of the sample articles for your reference. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to express my views. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Your concerns remain, NEP in page number 14, I believe, talks about including, different kinds of brailles, both standard and non-standard braille practice into the classroom. It, of course, talk about deaf and others, but yes, that challenge remains, and we have to see how we include.
No, Minati, deliberately I have put, because NIOS plays a very significant role, has been given the responsibility for sign language.
Yeah.
And until unless we all as a community become sensitive to it, because it's not about they only use, for example, now closed captioning in our Netflix and everywhere we see, and how much access it has given us to so many types of movies and other things which earlier we could not access because of the language barrier. So things are not about children with disabilities only. It is about the type of different type of things we have. And today we are talking about technology use more and more. So my whole thing goes a bit, because language is the main thing. Language is communication, and that is where the whole human race is involved in. That's
also, the language diversities manifest themselves in different forms.
Sure.
I think sometimes when we become too rhetorical,
that is the difference.
Children's languages should be used, we often lose sight of, from what do they manifest in terms of cognitive skills, in terms of self-related beliefs, in terms of subjectivities, how we feel about everything. So whatever, the child is not about just the language that he speaks.
It's something more, yeah.
So I think diversities of different kinds also.
Minati, my only point was we do have a more discussion about children, but we should never forget also the adult students also. Because when Northeast, they asked me, NCERT book में family की बात करते हैं, madam ये family क्या होता है? Because many of us, we do not know why the number of orphans in Arunachal was so large in the 80s. Because their marriage system, their family conception is very different than what we all have and what we write in our textbook. So these were vice principals who were my students at teacher training. And they are asking me this question. So imagine what else goes on in our classes.
Yeah, no. It's a new question I see. Dear Brinda, why didn't you read out?
Yeah, there is a hand raised by Manish Singh.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Please, yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. Ma'am, it was not a query. I just had curiosity, ma'am. With respect to the competence of learning a language or purity, what Jingranson was talking about, ma'am, are we getting too liberal in assuming that it will automatically get improved over the time, the competence part, the impurity part? I'm asking this question because being part of a recruitment system and also part of a training academy, what we see that when we give this leeway while recruiting a candidate, that one day he will automatically improve all the impurities and all the incompetence what he's having with that particular language. But what we have seen in the academy is that incompetence is not corrected, and that the habit of doing mistake or the habit of learning in the wrong way, it remains with that particular person. So are we getting too liberal in assuming that it will automatically take its course and it will improve itself?
Can I answer it? Then others can join. Manish, a language, the way human beings, Homo sapiens, evolved with language is slightly different. It has a different history compared to other cognitive skills. If we accept this hardware, language acquisition device thesis, then very young learners, as we see, learn language without being formally taught. They're not constantly corrected or taught a language. They hear, they participate in that community in using that language to express himself, and picks up the language and picks up the structure, the linguistic structure very well. Okay, and therefore the child is teaching himself because the child is wired for it. Okay, when it comes to other behaviors, I don't think we are wired similarly. So I would make a one-to-one comparison between language learning and developing other kinds of competences. That's one. Second, okay, I'll just give this answer. If I do not, then I will not extend my assumptions in language learning to other domains of cognitive or other kinds of behavior. Others can join so that it can be expanded. You need some corrections. Okay, since others are not saying, Dheer, you're muted, Dheer. You are muted, yeah.
You can?
Yes, now.
Yeah, so Miniti, I was wanting to comment on this, very widespread assumption, and the NEP also has this, that children at a young age can learn multiple languages.
Yeah.
Now, we all know that is done in a natural environment where there's a lot of natural input in a very contextual kind of setting. It does not apply to a taught situation. Where teaching and learning is done through textbooks in a very formal manner, that is probably the worst way to learn a new language. But the education policy and in the field, this is a very common assumption. छोटे बच्चे हैं वो तो आराम से सीख जाएंगे, 2-3-4 भाषाएं सीख जाएंगे. While we know that for a child to actually learn through teaching and learning requires a kind of meta-linguistic awareness that comes at a slightly later stage to be able to compare and contrast. This myth we see so often in administration, in teachers, etc. So I just want to say that it should be qualified by saying that in natural, rich language use, purposeful, meaningful use of language settings. That's all.
There is also another thing that, if you say the opposite, then you almost support a regimented very pedantic, kind of pedagogic practices. So I think we go overboard with suggesting that corrections should be less. I think the fear is that the classroom becomes more about corrections, about guided learning. And so what we do is to the other extreme, saying that no, children learn, they need a lot of freedom to learn. So I think it's somewhere between these two, what he is saying. Yes, in natural context, we don't often correct. Parents do correct, but we don't have to correct. We learn through observation. And in classroom, yes, some corrections are required, but no, your pedagogy has to be very different. What they were saying, more metacognitive inputs would be required. Of course, freedom is also required. Metacognition works with freedom. Yeah, that's the trick. Metacognitive inputs get obstructed when we also interfere with children's freedom to articulate things. Yeah.
There is another question by Brinda. I see it's a long question, so I would ask Brinda to unmute the mic and please ask the question.
Sure. I'll just do that.
Yeah.
So this was based on what Dr. Sudesh Mukhopadhyay was saying and what Meenakshi ma'am how she responded to it. So there are many different kinds of diversities within a diverse language classroom also. So what I was curious about was, especially as children move to a more secondary or higher education stage, how do we introduce this understanding that the languages they're operating with or how the languages are positioned within the classroom are not at an equal stage? And this is, I think, both a sociological and a social psychological question, because sometimes it might affect the self-esteem or the attitudes of students towards each other. So what I was asking was that this inequality can be between the teacher and student, but between students too. So how do we introduce that awareness about political position that the different language varieties within the same classroom are occupying? And similarly, how can classroom practices, including teaching, address these social relationships which don't affect the students negatively? Yeah.
Brinda, in say university classrooms, how I address this question, and this question can be asked in different domains, actually, other domains other than language. The first thing I believe, I think it would be useful is to talk about these differences and where do these differences come from and what do these differences do to students. So the languages are not at the same level. That's the first thing we should talk about. And how they position students differently. The second thing, we should consciously even talk about the classroom. Of course, there will be many pedagogic tools one can bring into the classroom to disturb the language hierarchy of the classroom. I have seen that if there is a student from St. Stephen's, how the students sort of silences many students coming from rural areas in India, in JNU. So what do you do so that some of the intellectual capabilities of students coming from rural areas get attention, and where they perform, they outperform, So the teacher also has to pedagogically disturb the already settled, very hierarchically settled classroom, And so my first attempt would be, if it is higher, if it is college or university classrooms, talk about differences and discriminations right away. And then talk about how the classroom is essentially a violent place. It is internally violent because these hierarchies are reproduced by the classroom pedagogy. And third, what do we do together to disturb this, predatory, disturb this extremely, unequal space? And that is where, instead of being a teacher, that is where, instead of deciding myself, I would also involve students to tell me what to do. So I bring a few things to classroom. I also ask students to be doing few things. I think that way it works better. You know, a classroom is a very bloody space. It's a very, very violent place. And we don't recognize them because we are still occupying a senior, higher position. We don't see how students every day bleed because of our behavior or the kind of behaviors we support in the classroom, which are unequal. I think inequality of all kinds should be first outrightly discussed, recognized, and teachers and students together should be working towards a pedagogy that questions this highly bloodied and violent space. I see children's bodies being extremely violent, and we produce that violence. And these inequalities produce those violence. And therefore, violence has to be, I'm not scared to talk about. Okay, I'm not talking about young children now, but I'll not be scared, even with young children, to talk about inequalities, producing certain kinds of latent violence in children's bodies and mind. Anybody else? I'm coming from my classroom, so anybody else?
No, I just wanted to add to this thing that when we look at a teaching learning situation, it is not something which happens only in a classroom. The timetable is not only for language. Language is something, one way is formally whatever grounds we are preparing, but then there are many other things also which happen in an institute. And some of these issues, the teacher's sensitivity and responsiveness to that situation in the classroom, that is where one role comes. But there are also many other occasions where we can give them a chance. And I know I have tried, as I am saying, as a teacher educator and in the other types of classrooms, because even where we have, say, reservations or multiple, for example, in regional colleges, we get students from, say, in the same college, I will get it from Maharashtra, I will also get from Gujarat, I will also get from Bhopal, and some, say, Goa, Daman, Diu, and all those type of things. But what is the characteristics of this student? The Bhopal students are normally from well-to-do families, some of them English medium, but those who come from these type of other states, they are not necessary from that type. I had students who have sold their land to come to regional college so that they will get a minor. Now the personalities are very different in the same class. Even the way they gestures, for example, in some of my, this student, we say yes, they say yes. If you go to from students from South, they will say, so which becomes altogether a very different answer. And when I have also students with disability in my classroom, the whole game differs. But then if I create other situations besides that particular lecture of 40 minutes or 1 hour classroom, where I give these students also a chance to show what talent they have brought, irrespective of their other conditions, then these equalities, they get adjusted. And that is how one of my blind students who was not allowed to record the teacher's lesson, I'm talking about something in 1981-82, today he is a reader of English language, one of the colleges, and has got an organization also. And he's a blind. No, so I think these questions.
Can I add something here?
Yes, sure, Cynthia. Sure.
Yeah, no, I just want to say it's true that drawing attention to the inequalities in the classroom itself is very important. So thank you, Brenda, for that question. And I don't have any answer on the tip of my tongue, but it inspires me to go to other fields like critical race theory. I know there are a lot of scholars out there trying to work on this. How do we address inequalities in an equitable way in diverse classrooms? So keep looking for those answers.
2 small things I want to mention here. One is, the teacher himself is the product of this violent, unequal society. So teacher is not only the perpetrator, teacher is also a victim. So while the teacher is trying to disturb the power hierarchy of the classroom, the teacher is also helping himself or herself to reflect on what has gone with him or her. And therefore the teacher, that's critical pedagogy, critical race theory, Yes, I mean, you do it for both. Second, in the classroom, like what Dhir was talking about, we had tried a lot of these in our multilingual education classroom in 2007, 8, 9 in Odisha, Saura and Gajapati and Kondhamal area, where when we bring children's knowledge systems, their emotional, we recognize their emotional experiences or their simple emotions. When we recognize their languages, we actually create possibilities for dialogue. And when this dialogue takes place, a lot of these power asymmetric spaces get reconfigured. Okay, and I think what we are doing to enhance learning also partly addresses the question of power and overdeterminism. This body being overdetermined or mind being overdetermined by these power structures. So that's one. But second, what critical, what Cynthia was saying, critical pedagogy talks about this, that please don't shy away from the questions of inequality. Talk about it upfront, bring to the class. Do not underestimate the capacity of students to handle it. So I think power asymmetry should be talked about outrightly. But this cultural psychological approach partly takes care of, this kind of asymmetry. I think Mr. Upendra Reddy wants to say something.
Yes.
Nikita?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, madam. Thank you, Jingran sir and Mohanty sir. After a long time, I'm able.
Nice to see you.
Yes. Yeah. This mother tongue based multilingual education, earlier it is the practice in tribal area, and majority in majority area the schools are in mother tongue only. But now slowly the governments now switching over to English. Now Andhra Pradesh switched over completely from class 1 to onwards English medium. Yes. Even Telangana government also recently announced that they are also going now. And even Child Rights Convention says, even our constitution says that it is the right of the child to get to at least primary education in the mother tongue. But nobody actually listening to it actually. And our Jingran sir and some is working in many areas with government system. How to actually switch over from mother tongue to how to bridge from mother tongue to the next language. It's only happening in some pockets where the governments are very motivated and good commissions are there. But in majority of the schools now, it is the non-comprehension, especially in Telangana and Andhra, where more private schools are there. More than 50% private schools are there, and medium of instruction is English. And there's a great non-comprehension is there. It's a violence on the part of the children. So, but when convention says, when constitution says the right of the child, any pill in Supreme Court, something like that, can help these governments to take a decision on it. And how long we can talk this MT-based multilingual, mother tongue-based multilingualism in some small packet, but majority are getting affected. Now Mohanty sir says that now just think on not learning, but thinking actually, okay? But that is not really happening. Now you say critical pedagogy, all these things, where language plays a very vital role in this, in critical pedagogy actually, where children, Digan sir also says now the same thing. As an organization, multilingual organization, when state governments one after the other actually switching over without developing the capacity of the teachers or teacher education institutions, what is the way out?
Market will determine the rule of the game. Even if we are talking in very idealistic language now, fact is that we are promoting multilingual education, and at the same time, we are asking states to close thousands of government schools. Delhi government, which looks very progressive, the current one, has overnight converted the Hindi medium schools into English medium schools. And it happened 4 or 5 years back. When we did our JNU Cambridge study in Delhi, we suddenly discovered that the schools where we are working and the children are taught in Hindi are officially English medium schools.
Okay.
This is this new government, I mean, Delhi government, which appears more progressive in school education. this desire for English education and English language is constructed.
Parents mostly.
By the
parents'
market.
desire, but not children's desire.
No, that's what, it's a constructed one. So the whole drive for English education is constructed by the political leaders, by, by the market, and the state also is partly going with it. We have to register. So I support multilingual education initiative. But see how the scope of it will be foreclosed very soon with a very early, transition model because of the pressure that market will put on the state, and also the state itself. Finally, the state recognizes major languages. So I don't know. I mean, this is a struggle we have to fight. Don't think that you are going to solve it because any people.
But even our people are unable
to do it.
No, our people are unable to teach mother tongue also. No, our Pradham says that even in Telugu,
we didn't even discuss.
Mother tongue also. But even in English, we have introduced English in class 1. After 10 years in class 10, children are unable to speak in English now. After 10 years with trained teachers in English. So somewhere they're switching, it become a politically motivated thing of switching over to, but without understanding where we actually stand.
Yeah, Dhir wants to leave. I think we'll quickly wind up. Just one thing I want to say, in these kinds of places, we talk about language, but we don't talk about actual classroom pedagogy. Because even if we bring children's languages, how to develop higher order thinking, how to develop a larger semiotic base for, say, learning mathematics or science, we don't talk about, because we never go that far. We just stop it that, use of children's languages help and they do great job. And we do a fairly good job till we are talking about, say, class 3, class 4 or class 5. But when the future learning is based on these higher order cognitive functions, what is the nature of those functions? What are those in terms of cognitive skills? And how does classroom pedagogy builds on it is something that we should debate in future. I'm happy that Dhir is now talking about it quite often. So, but we don't get into these debates, because of our, almost, it's overwhelming, the question of language. So it doesn't allow you to go beyond the rhetorics of language use. Yeah. Dhir, say.
Just one point. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
At this National Steering Committee for NCFs, language, as we all know, gets into various things. I keep asking, are you serious about other parts of the NEP which talk about critical thinking, creativity, higher order? Forget about language. But if you think that is the direction that we have to move in, there is no alternative but to include children's languages. So forget about mother tongue based and all that. Are you serious about all of the NEP which talks about critical thinking, etc.? That will be useless. That's contradictory. So I agree that that's the line that, anyway.
No, I mean, we have to dialogue little more, and NEP 2020, all said and done, has given this scope. This one at least is talking about. So let's meet little more often.
Yeah.
And I will write to all of you. Here is anyway doing a lot in education now. So we will create more opportunities for dialogue from NMRC with all of you. Nikita, will you thank everybody? I anyway thank from the bottom of my heart. Yeah. Marcy. We were a little silent and we were sleeping for some time, and we are planning to come back, but we'll be back more to, more into the domain of academic dialogues. Intervention is a very, very challenging. We worked on MLE Plus program, and we were reasonably happy with a lot of our, experimenting with a lot of our ideas, many psychological theories and ideas we had. But intervening requires a lot of resources. So we'll be doing more conceptual dialogue and some intervention work, but more conceptual dialogue. So in future, we'll be interacting with you more. May we are doing a major conference, and I will send to you the announcement and talk to you directly about the conference also for your participation. Yeah, Nikita again.
Yeah, so I would like to thank all the panelists for a profoundly insightful lecture, and I would also like to thank participants for a very engaging discussion, and hope this webinars like these keep on organizing like this. So now I would probably end the meeting. Or ma'am, do you want to say something else?
And Nikita works on reflexive pedagogy, that too in higher education. I forced her to organize this because I was supreme busy, and I thought whoever is close to me can organize. This is not her area. So thank you, Nikita. Thank you for helping me. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Cynthia, Dhir, Ajit, everybody, all the participants, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Jingran sir, thank you.
You can switch off now. Dhir, thank you.